Welcome to the debate. Today, we're looking into the collapse of the Washwood Heath investment scheme. It's a really complex situation, this localized fraud that preyed on community trust. And the key question we're wrestling with is, what really caused the breaking point? Was it fundamentally a psychological failure? Hope just running out, people exhausted by the excuses? Or was it more structural, driven by everyone finally sharing information and seeing the bigger picture? I'll be arguing that the collapse was, at its core, psychological.
And I'm going to argue the opposite, essentially, that the breaking point was structural. Specifically, it came down to a failure of information control. The community network itself became the fact-checker, and that's what exposed the whole thing as unsustainable. A systemic failure, really.
Right, so my view really leans on this idea of emotional capital. The scheme, well, it stayed afloat because of Ghazala Din's clear instruction. Keep them hoping. As long as they're hoping, they won't fight back. And the evidence, I think, points to the failure happening when the key players, the agents like Humaira and Ruxar, just couldn't bear the moral weight anymore. Humaira's breakdown after that confrontation with the widow, Ruxar's deep shame, it points to this individual human fragility. The psychological cost of keeping up the lie became too much, and that created the first real irreparable crack. So for me, it buckled under internal psychological pressure first.
I see that, but I tend to view the psychological cost as, well, an inevitable result rather than the initial trigger. I think the structural mechanism gave way first. The material specifically mentions people starting to compare notes. That's the critical shift, isn't it? Turning individual suspension into collective proof. The structure I'm talking about is the scheme's ability to keep information siloed, controlled. And that structure just disintegrated when, WhatsApp groups started lighting up with screenshots. People could see, irrefutably, that Ghazala was feeding the exact same next week line to basically everyone, simultaneously. That shared, verifiable proof, not just individual despair, is what really killed the deception's viability.
Okay, I agree. The shared evidence was absolutely critical. But let's think about its main effect. If it was just about cold, hard proof of insolvency, why did it spark such immediate, intense psychological fallout? The shared knowledge didn't just confirm the numbers didn't add up, it unleashed this wave of, crushing shame and contempt. Think about the term thieves in hijabs, or that awful silence at family weddings. That sudden, powerful emotional shift. The community collectively losing hope and becoming hostile. That feels like the real psychological driver that pushed things over the edge.
That's a fair distinction, but the timeline still feels a bit off with that theory for me. Shame is potent, absolutely. But it seems like it only became this widespread, powerful force after the community used its existing networks, the quiet chats at the mosque, the phone calls between relatives, to gather that verifiable shared proof about the recycled excuses. So the structural failure of the narrative, the lies being exposed, had to come before that massive psychological shift, didn't it? I mean, if the emotional collapse came first, why did the shame only hit critical mass once the shared data made the lies totally undeniable?
Well, let's focus on a specific human trigger then. The text gives us a pretty clear picture of the collapse through Humaira's reaction, her guilt after the widow confronted her. To me, that signals the scheme was crumbling from the inside, driven by the agent's own moral burden becoming unbearable, that erosion of conscience. That's fundamentally a psychological failure, and it seems to precede the wider public action.
That's a compelling story, the individual conscience breaking. But I'm not quite convinced Humaira's personal guilt was the starting pistol. Her reaction feels more like a symptom, doesn't it? Think about the widow's action itself. That very public, dramatic demand for her money back. Talking about pawned bangles and hungry kids. That kind of public confrontation, well, it was probably only possible because the community network had already structurally shown her that her individual hope was misplaced. The certainty that the money was gone, confirmed by everyone comparing notes. That structural certainty gave her the platform, the leverage for that loud public demand. That demand then triggered Humaira's emotional response. So I see it as community mobilization structurally enabling the confrontation, which then led to the agent's psychological breaking point, not the other way around.
Look, ultimately, while I absolutely concede that structural lies were the foundation of the scheme, I still maintain the decisive factor, the thing that brought it all down, was hitting the limit of human endurance, the capacity to keep up the manipulation or for the victims to keep enduring it. That shift from clinging to individual hope to facing this collective, crushing shame, that's what finally broke the spell.
And I suppose I just keep coming back to the structure. The evidence for me points strongly that way. It was the community networks generating data, comparing notes, sharing the proof publicly. That's what turned isolated doubts into a collective, informed certainty. The scheme collapsed because its core mechanism, spreading unverified lies person by person, was fundamentally exposed and broken by the very community trust networks it tried to exploit.
It's definitely a case, the Washwood Heath situation, that gives us some really fascinating insight into how trust, information, and misinformation all work in these tightly knit communities. Really highlights the vulnerabilities in these kinds of deceitful schemes.